Bruce, hello, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us here on TVP World.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Great to have you, Bruce. So, well, I mean, around 30% of the votes have been counted, 80% odd voting for Putin, apparently. No surprises there, would you agree?
Oh, no surprises at all. I mean, this was expected to begin with. I mean, a lot of people just said reselection, not re-election, because the results were well known way in advance. It was just a question of what numbers they were going to come up with.
Right. Now, Russian citizens living outside Russia were also able to vote, weren't they, at the embassy? Have you heard anything about how those citizens voted?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard to say how they voted. They weren't telling journalists specifically, although some did indicate they were voting for Putin. But the line to vote at the Russian embassy in Astana, Kazakhstan, was more than a kilometer long. People that went by the Russian consulate today earlier in Kazakhstan, down south, said there was at least a couple thousand people in line. Pretty much across the board, it was like that. At Tashkent, there was a lot of people that came up in Uzbekistan, a lot of Russian citizens that showed up and cast their votes. And by a lot, I mean several hundreds and possibly 1,000 or 2,000. So, it's for how many Russian citizens there were there, it's difficult to say if that's a lot or not very many at all.
Right. I mean, do you think some of these, I know it's difficult to be sure, but do you think some of these might have been people who actually left Russia when they invaded Ukraine to avoid being called up into the army?
Interestingly, a few people in Almaty in Kazakhstan did say that they had left Russia to avoid mobilization. Why they were willing to admit this it's very interesting to think about. But they all the same, they did come there and cast their ballots, or it's possible they were part of this protest action. That the opposition had called for people to show up at noon to cast their votes as a way of protesting.
Right. Yes. Well, talking about opposition, I mean, we've just heard a news item about the death of Navalny, and was there really any opposition, any credible opposition to Putin?
I mean, from the start, there wasn't. These things are a formality. They have it's the same script that they use in Central Asia. They pick a couple people to be the opponents in the election. For the most part, the general population doesn't know much or anything about them at all. They're there as window dressing for these elections. Again, the results are more or less known in advance.
Right.
And it was kind of interesting that the Kazakh president met Vladimir Putin in February and told him the results are not in doubt. Now, you can read that many ways, but it kind of shows that Central Asia holds these kind of elections, and so they all figured that Putin's so-called re-election was fait accompli. There was no doubt that he was going to win the election, and by a hefty margin.
Right. See, one thing that I've never been clear about, Bruce, I mean, Putin's already got all the power. His position, certainly from the outside, seems secure. His population is suppressed. Why does he need the supposed legitimacy of an election?
This is an interesting question. In countries all around the world, even the most despotic countries, you can imagine, for some reason, they feel the need to go through the formality of election. It gives them an opportunity to say, I have support from the people. They had a chance to come out and cast ballots, and I was elected in a free and what they would call a free and fair election. Now, we know that this wasn't a free and fair election, but all governments, or at least most governments, go through the motions of doing this again and again to kind of reinforce the fact somehow or another that they are legitimate leaders of their countries. They weren't put in there by the military or anything. People had a chance to come out, cast their ballots, and decide who they wanted to be the leader of the country. And when the ballots were all counted, this is the person that won, even if we know years in advance that he's going to win when they have an election. But they feel the need to go through it anyway.
Yes, quite a strange situation indeed. Now, the FSB, the previously known as the KGB, the security services in Russia, very powerful. And clearly they would have had an influence on the leadership on the election, and it seems as though they're supporting Putin. Would you agree, or do you think there might be trouble brewing there?
Well, I mean, generally, if you're going to be a leader in of the sort that Putin is, you have to rely on your security service. I mean, this is true of authoritarian leaders around the world. They spend a lot of money on the security services, partially to buy loyalty. I mean, generally, the people that are in the FSB or similar organizations in other countries are well paid. They have good housing. I mean, so they owe almost everything to the leadership. There's a motivation for them to make sure that their guy stays in power. So I don't see, any problems within the FSB. There might be other bodies within the Russian government or other individuals within the Russian government who would prefer that Putin finally step down. He's getting on in years. He's been there a long time. But the fact is that the security services, when you're the kind of government that Russia has, and when you're the kind of leader that Putin is, you have to depend on your security service. So you generally treat them very well.
Right. Now, you mentioned the fact that, Putin seems to have the support to stay on for another till the next elections. Thing is he holding on to power simply because he's concerned about what might happen if he stepped down, that he might actually be a target of some of his political opponents?
That could happen. We've certainly seen, there's precedent for this. We've seen in recent years where a leader decides to step down after a long time. I'm thinking of Kazakhstan, actually, but there they had a president who had stepped down after being in power for, more than 25 years. And it wasn't very long before his hand-picked successor came into conflict with him and eventually ousted him. And now you don't see him too much anymore. I think Putin is afraid of that happening to him. If they say had a more liberal government, a more democratic government that came to power in Russia, you would think one of the things they would do to gain popularity would be to start revealing information on what he was up to when he was president, how much money left the country or went into his personal bank account or the bank accounts of his friends. These are the kind of things they don't want. And now on top of this, Putin is in a position where he's essentially a criminal. Right. I mean, even the international court has said that, the kidnapping of Ukrainian children and sending them off to Russia to new families, not even counting the war crimes that have been happening in Ukraine itself. The massacres, the rapes, the tortures, all that kind of stuff. I mean, there's numerous charges he could be put up on if he were to lose power and fall out of favor with whoever his successor was.
Right. So he's holding on to avoid that, what one assumes or presumes. Now, are we going to see more of the same? Is he going to get better or worse in the international political arena, Bruce?
Well, it seems like he's putting all his money on the war footing that they're on now. I mean, that's the big thing that he thinks is going to gain him popularity. That Russia is a mighty country. That they're going to reclaim territory that was illegally, in his view, taken. I mean, he said, that historically Russian lands are all the territory of the former Soviet Union. That seems to be his policy now. That's what he's running on now. So as long as you got this policy and you're portraying everyone who's against it in the West as the enemy, you fall back on a very old script that they were using during Soviet times of, if it's not me, we risk going down as a whole nation. So this is what we have to do to protect ourselves. And that is his policy. And I imagine will be for the rest of this term anyway, should he survive the rest of this term. Again, he's not a young man.
No, quite. Talking of his age, I mean, there have been rumours, haven't there, in the past about his health deteriorating. Have you heard anything about that, Bruce, at all?
I haven't heard recently. Of course, he's had problems in the past. Mostly just the usual physical problems, back problems, things like that. You've heard undoubtedly the stories that maybe he has blood poisoning or something. This is very shadowy territory. If you remember back in the Soviet Union, every time one of their leaders got sick, it was hard to figure out if it was a minor cold or if they might actually already be dead by the time someone admitted that
Right.
they were treated. So, I think we're going to have the same problem with Putin. They've really gone back to that kind of propaganda and that kind of media coverage where if Putin is ill, you won't hear anything about it at all. And we know that there's doubles that he uses to come out in some places. I mean, it was significant, I thought anyway, that he didn't even bother to go to an actual polling station to cast his ballot.
Yeah.
They made a big deal out of putting him on video and sitting in his office and voting over his computer. You can read a lot of things into that. Is it because he's so worried that actually he is unpopular and he might actually get heckled or something at one of the polling stations? Maybe. Or is it the fact that maybe he's got a health issue and he didn't want to be seen out there looking unhealthy, having problems moving around or something, and so it was safer to put him in a chair and have him vote on the internet.
Right. Well, that is, as you say, quite interesting. But I mean, it's rare to see him out and about, and it's difficult to tell, perhaps, whether he's simply concerned about his security or whether there are other reasons for it. Now, in terms of the prosecution of his war or his invasion of Ukraine, how do you see that playing out in terms of his alliances, really, with North Korea, with China, with Turkey, perhaps?
With North Korea and China, I think there's no danger of those relationships souring at all. I mean, they seem to be, certainly North Korea and China seem to be, if not wholly supportive of Putin, at least they don't want to see Russia go down and be humiliated, because then they lose a key strong ally. If a weak Russia is bad for both China and North Korea because they would lose that. But him as a strong ally. Turkey is a different question because we're never really sure what Turkey's policy is toward this. They've supplied Ukraine with drones. They've actually enforced embargoes on shipping that goes through at times through the Bosphorus Straits. So Turkey seems to be taking advantage of every side that it can in this conflict. I wouldn't put Turkey in the same sentence as North Korea and China, because Turkey is acting in its own interest and it seems to be working with both sides in this conflict.
Well, it certainly has been, Bruce, but it does seem to be very keen to insert itself into peace negotiations and other negotiations, as well as trade issues with Russia. So, going forward, does Putin have any potential opponent who might try and dislodge him, unseat him? Or are they all dead now?
I don't know if they're all dead. I think a lot is dependent upon how their invasion of Ukraine goes moving forward. Let's not forget that when they had the Wagner group rebellion, when the Wagner group entered some of these cities in Russia en route to Moscow, they were greeted very warmly by the population. Now, clearly, there's a large element in Russia that really doesn't support Putin, but is afraid of challenging him without anyone to support them in that challenge. So, but I mean, I always go back to this, and Putin must think about this too. Is that a lot of people seem very happy to greet Prigozhin and his people when they showed up in their town. You have to think that sentiment is fairly widespread around Russia. It's more a question of fear, the kind of fear that the government has instilled in the population. And we see it. Just look at some of the people that spoiled the ballots, either lit the ballot boxes on fire or dumped, green iodine into the ballot box, and were detained. I mean, hauled away immediately. That's what people are afraid of, is that if they come out in opposition to the Kremlin publicly, that they are going to be imprisoned, tortured. Who knows? How Putin got 87% of the vote. How many of those people would flip and support somebody else if they thought they had a chance? It's a legitimate question. I would imagine a lot of them would. But so long as Putin is able to portray himself as prosecuting a successful military campaign or special operation, in Ukraine, I think that will help to cement some of his support. If he's seen to be losing badly, then we would have to see if somebody in the background doesn't step forward and say, enough is enough, and now we're about to lose this war. We've already suffered huge casualties, and this is going to lead to a number of other problems if we don't get this guy out now.
Right. Well, we'll be watching very carefully, as I'm sure you will. Bruce, thank you very much for coming along and sharing your insights. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Have a good evening.